Walter Meece stood at the edge of the burn pile with a rake in one hand and watched the last of the brush collapse into itself, 40 years of blackberry cane and sumac and fallen cedar limbs finally giving up their shape and settling into a low bed of gray ash and orange coals. The fire had been going since noon. It was close to 5 now, the light starting to lean long and gold across the back pasture, and Walter had reached the part of a controlled burn he'd always found the quietest, the part where there was nothing left to do but watch it finish and wait for it to be safe enough to walk across. He raked the outer edge and toward the center out of habit, more than necessity, and that was when the rake caught on something that wasn't ash. It caught on an edge, hard and square, buried maybe 2 inches under the surface, and when Walter knelt down and brushed the top layer away with the back of the rake head, there was stone underneath. Not a stray fieldstone kicked loose from a fence row. A flat, worked edge, cut clean on one side, sitting level with the one beside it the way a step sits level with the step below it. He stopped. He looked at it for a long moment, and then he looked at the shape of the ground running back from it, up into the low rise behind the barn that had been covered in brush for as long as he could remember, longer than that, brush his father had never cleared and his grandfather before him had never cleared, a corner of the property that had simply always been the scrub patch, the place nobody ran cattle and nobody planted and nobody, as far as Walter knew, had ever had a reason to look at closely. A neighbor named Dale Pruitt, who'd driven over that afternoon to help keep an eye on the burn the way men in that part of Greene County did for each other when somebody had a big brush pile going, walked up behind him and looked down at the exposed stone. "Was that always there?" Dale asked. "I don't know," Walter said, and he didn't say anything else for a while, just knelt there with the rake handle across his knees, looking at a piece of ground he'd walked past his whole life without ever once wondering what was underneath it. If stories about old land and the things buried quietly under it are the kind you come back for, there's a subscribe button below, and we'd like to know where you're watching from. Walter Meece was 54 years old that October, back on the 110 acres in the eastern Tennessee foothills where he'd grown up, farming the same rough mix of hay ground and timbered slope his grandfather had cleared by hand in the years before the war. He had taken the place over from his father in 2003, when the older man's heart had finally given out after a decade of slowing down, and Walter had run it more or less the way his father had, a small herd of beef cattle on the open pasture, hay cut twice a season off the bottom ground, a little timber pulled off the back 40 in lean years, enough to keep the note paid and the lights on without any illusion that farming that ground was ever going to make anyone rich. He had never married, not for lack of trying so much as for lack of anyone who wanted to build a life around the particular rhythm of 110 acres that required someone home most mornings and most evenings, and he had settled, somewhere in his 40s, into a kind of steady solitary competence that suited him better than he might have admitted to anyone who asked. He kept the fences up. He kept the equipment running. He burned the brush pile behind the barn every 3 or 4 years when it got too thick to mow around, the way his father had done before him, and the way his father's father had done before that, because a corner of ground too steep and too rocky to plant tended to grow up and scrub if you let it sit, and burning it back was simply what you did with ground like that. Nobody in 3 generations of Meece men had ever asked what was underneath it, because there had never been a reason to ask. It was brush. Brush grew on ground nobody used. That was the whole of the thinking, passed down without much examination, the way a lot of small unquestioned habits get passed down on a farm that's been in a family a long time. The stone changed that without any ceremony at all. Walter spent the rest of that evening, once the ash had cooled enough to walk on safely, clearing the loose char and debris away from the exposed edge with his hands and a garden trowel, working slowly in the fading light until he'd uncovered enough to see that it wasn't one stone. It was a run of them, for visible so far, each roughly 2 feet wide, rising at a shallow, even grade up into the hillside, cut and fitted with a level of care that fieldstone piled for a fence row never got. Somebody had built these on purpose, a long time ago, and somebody had let 40 years of brush grow up over them since, whether on purpose or simply through the ordinary neglect that swallows anything a family stops paying attention to. He went back out the next morning before his regular chores and kept clearing, working down the run of steps with a small hand trowel and a stiff brush, brushing loose soil and ash out from between the joints the way he imagined an archaeologist might, though he had no training in it and no real plan beyond curiosity pulling him forward one step at a time. By mid-morning he had 6 steps clear, then 7, the grade steepening slightly as it climbed, and at the top of the 7th step, where the hillside itself began, there was something that was not stone at all. It was iron, rusted nearly the color of the dirt around it, a strap hinge bolted into a wooden frame that had gone gray and soft with age, half sunk into the hillside and half hidden under a final tangle of root and brush that the fire hadn't reached. A door. Set into the hill itself, the way an old root cellar or a spring house might be built into a slope to take advantage of the ground's natural insulation, except Walter had never known there to be a root cellar on the property at all, and his father, in all the years Walter had worked alongside him, had never once mentioned one. He drove over that same afternoon to see Otis Ledbetter, who at 89 was the oldest man left in that end of the county and had known Walter's grandfather personally, back when both of them were young men working adjoining farms along the same creek bottom. Otis came out onto his porch slow, the way he did everything now, and Walter told him what he'd found, the steps, the door, all of it. Otis was quiet for a moment, looking off toward the tree line rather than at Walter. "Your grandfather never talked about that place," he said. "What place?" Walter asked. Otis didn't answer that. He turned and went back inside, leaving Walter standing on the porch steps with considerably more questions than he'd arrived with. "Now let me pause here and ask you something, because it's worth sitting with for a moment before we go any further. When you find something that 3 generations of your own family walked past without ever mentioning, what does the silence itself tell you? Not what's behind the door. The silence. Because a thing that's simply forgotten gets talked about eventually, sooner or later, in passing, at a family supper, at a funeral, somewhere. A thing that's been kept quiet on purpose stays quiet in a very specific way, the way Otis Ledbetter had just gone quiet on his own porch. Walter drove home turning that over the whole way, and that evening, once the light started going, he went back out to the hillside with a flashlight and a pry bar, more out of a restlessness he couldn't quite name than any clear plan. The door didn't open easily. It wasn't locked, not in any way Walter could find, a simple wooden latch on the outside that lifted freely, but something on the other side was resisting it, a weight or a brace he couldn't see. That single detail sat with him more than anything else had so far. A forgotten door built into a hillside was strange enough. A forgotten door that seemed to be braced shut from the inside was something else. He didn't force it that night. He went back to the house, and he sat at his kitchen table with a cup of coffee going cold in front of him, and he thought about buried money and bootleg liquor and every other story a man's imagination reaches for when he finds a locked door on his own land and no family member left living who'll explain it to him. He wasn't sure which possibility unsettled him more, only that he needed to know which one it actually was, or whether it was neither, which seemed, the longer he sat with it, like the most likely answer of all. He mentioned it at the feed store 2 days later, mostly because a man named Curtis Blevins asked him how the burn had gone, and Walter, not thinking much of it, told him about the steps. Curtis laughed, not unkindly, the easy laugh of a man who'd heard plenty of stories about old root cellars and spring houses turning out to be exactly what they looked like and nothing more. Probably just an old root cellar, Walter. Every farm around here's got one somewhere nobody remembers. Not worth tearing your hillside up over it. A couple of the other men standing near the counter nodded along, the way men do when a reasonable-sounding explanation gets offered and nobody has a better one to counter it with. Walter didn't argue the point. He bought his feed and drove home, and that evening he went back out to the hillside anyway, because whatever Curtis Blevins believed about root cellars, Walter had seen the way that door was braced, and a root cellar didn't generally need bracing from the inside once the family that dug it was done using it. He worked at the hinge side of the door with the pry bar for the better part of an hour, working it loose a fraction of an inch at a time rather than forcing it, and when it finally gave, it gave all at once, the whole door swinging inward on its own weight with a low groan of old wood and older iron, and behind it, in the beam of his flashlight, was a small room cut into the hillside, roughly 8 feet by 10, dry, and smelling faintly of old wood and dust rather than the damp rot Walter had braced himself for. There was no gold. No cash box, nothing like what a man's imagination reaches for standing in front of a door that's been braced shut for decades. What there was, once Walter stepped inside and let the flashlight beam settle, was simpler than that, and in its own way stranger. Wooden shelves lined 2 of the walls, most of them empty now, their surfaces gone gray and soft with age. A stack of burlap sacks sat folded in one corner, brittle enough that Walter didn't try to lift them. A small hand-cranked grain mill sat bolted to a low bench along the back wall, its iron mechanism seized solid with rust. And on the shelf nearest the door, undisturbed by whatever had braced it shut all those years, was a notebook, its cover soft and curled with age but the pages inside still legibly dry. Walter sat down carefully on an overturned crate and opened it. On the first page, in handwriting he didn't recognize but that had the careful, even quality of someone writing slowly and deliberately, was a single date. 1932. It read more like a ledger than a diary, page after page of names and quantities in a steady hand. Corn meal. Dried beans. Salt pork. A number beside each name, no dollar figures anywhere on any page, just names and dates and what had been taken. Walter recognized some of the names, families whose descendants he still saw around the county, at the feed store, at church, people who had no idea, as far as he could tell, that their own family's name had once been written down in a ledger kept in a hidden room on the Meece property. He read for the better part of an hour by flashlight, working back through years that ran steady through the middle 1930s, and then, starting in a stretch that lined up with what Walter knew of the worst years of the Depression in that part of the state, the number of names on each page jumped, more families drawing on the room in a single season than had appeared across whole years before it, some names repeating month after month, others appearing only once and never again, as if whatever trouble had brought them there had passed as quickly as it came. He brought the ledger to Otis Ledbetter the following morning, and this time the old man was willing to talk. Otis told him that when he was a young man, that stretch of the county had gone through a season hard enough that it wasn't just one family struggling. It was most of the community, farms up and down that creek bottom coming up short in the same year, one poor harvest stacked on another until there wasn't much slack left in anyone's pantry by the time winter set in. Walter's grandfather, Otis said, had fared a little better than most that year, a grain store that hadn't run dry, a smokehouse that still had meat in it, and rather than let that sit behind a locked barn while neighbors went hungry, he'd built the little room into the hillside and turned it into something like a standing reserve. Anyone who needed something could come and take it. Nobody paid for it. Nobody signed anything promising to pay it back. Why didn't anybody ever tell me? Walter asked. Otis looked at him for a long moment. Because your grandfather didn't want anyone to. That was the whole point of it. Otis explained, in his own unhurried way, that Walter's grandfather had been a proud man in most respects, but not the kind of proud that wanted credit for helping a neighbor. He'd sealed the room himself once the worst of it passed, braced the door from the inside the way a man does when he intends for something to stay closed, and he'd never spoken of it again, not to his own son, not to anyone, as far as Otis knew, except whichever few neighbors had helped him keep the ledger running on the days he couldn't get out there himself, and every one of those men had long since passed on and taken the knowledge with them, the way a promise sometimes gets kept simply by everyone involved dying before they get around to breaking it. Going back through the room a few days later, Walter found, tucked into a narrow gap beneath the lowest shelf, a sealed envelope, the paper gone brittle and yellow. On the outside, in the same hand as the ledger, someone had written a single line. If this room is ever opened again. Walter opened it. The letter inside wasn't the kind of thing a proud man writes to be remembered by. His grandfather had written it plainly, the way Otis said he'd talked, explaining that a person who has to ask for food remembers that feeling for the rest of their life, and that he'd rather nobody in his community carry that weight if he could help it. That was why there was no debt recorded anywhere in the ledger, no accounting of who owed what to whom, just names and dates kept quietly for no reason Walter could find except to remember, privately, who had needed help and when. At the bottom, in the same steady hand, was the only instruction the old man had left behind. Take what your family needs. Leave what the next family may need. Walter sat with that letter for a long time before he folded it and set it back on the shelf. He looked around the little room differently after that, the empty shelves, the seized grain mill, the stack of burlap sacks in the corner, and understood, in a way he hadn't quite let himself understand standing there with a pry bar 2 days earlier, that the room hadn't been built to keep anything safe from other people. It had been built to keep people from ever having to feel the particular shame of asking for help out loud, in front of anyone, even a neighbor. He didn't tell many people what he'd found. He mentioned it to Dale Pruitt, who'd been there the day the fire first exposed the stone, and Dale drove over one evening not long after and stood in the doorway of the little room for a while without saying much, looking at the shelves, at the mill, at the ledger sitting closed on the shelf where Walter had put it back. Your grandfather would have liked that you didn't put a sign on it, Dale said finally. Didn't seem like it needed one, Walter said. Dale nodded slowly, the way a man does when something settles right in his mind after sitting wrong for a while. Walter repaired the door that fall, rehung it on a new hinge, cleared the last of the brush off the hillside above it so the stone steps stood open to the light for the first time in longer than anyone living could say for certain. He didn't turn the room into anything grand. He didn't announce it at church or mention it at the feed store beyond what he'd already told Dale and Curtis Blevins, who, when he heard the Fuller story secondhand, didn't say much about Ruth's cellars again. Walter simply left the door unbraced, cleared a narrow path up the hillside, and set a small wooden shelf just inside the entrance, the kind of thing a man does quietly when he's decided something ought to stay open rather than closed, without needing to explain to anyone exactly why. He turned to the last page of the ledger that had any writing on it, the final entry dated sometime in 1938, and beneath it, in his own hand, he wrote a single line. "The room is open again." The brush pile behind Walter Meece's barn is gone now, burned down to bare ground the way it had been 100 times before over 3 generations, except this time what came up out of the ash wasn't more scrub the following spring. It was 7 stone steps, cut clean and fitted by a man who's been gone the better part of 60 years, leading up to a door that stayed shut long enough for everyone who knew why to pass on without saying, and open now for anyone who wants to see what a family can build quietly and never once mention, not because they forgot, but because some men keep a promise simply by never breaking the silence around it. Would you have kept burning that brush pile the way it had always been burned, or would you have stopped the moment the rake caught on something that wasn't supposed to be there?